My mother ripped the doll I bought with 4 months of saved coins out of my daughter's hands, and my father said, "Your daughter is a mistake." I didn't yell. I simply froze my bank account and filed a report, never imagining that night they would come back for something even worse. At 4:52 a.m., I was still sitting at my kitchen table in yesterday's clothes, staring at a banking app like the numbers might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They didn't. $2,230 withdrawn. Not stolen by a stranger, not skimmed by some faceless scammer overseas. Withdrawn by my mother, using an account access she'd talked me into 5 years ago, with a voice so warm I actually believed she meant it. "In case you ever need help, sweetheart." I remembered the exact words. I remembered believing them. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Not from cold. The apartment was warm enough, the radiator ticking away in the corner like it always did at that hour. It was something else. Something colder than the room. Down the hall, my 5-year-old daughter Willow was asleep with her arm thrown over an old teddy bear that had lost one eye 2 Christmases ago. She didn't know yet that the rent money was gone. She didn't know that the woman who'd ripped a doll out of her hands 12 hours earlier had come back, quietly, digitally, and taken the rest. I hadn't screamed at the store. I hadn't screamed when my father called her a mistake, right to her small, listening face. I'd walked out with my jaw locked so tight it ached for hours. But sitting there at 4:52 in the morning, watching the number in that account tick down to something that wouldn't cover groceries, let alone rent, I understood something with a clarity that scared me more than the theft itself. This wasn't going to be the last time. Not unless I made it the last time. I picked up my phone and opened the number for my bank's fraud line. Then I put it back down because I realized I needed to write everything down first. Every date, every dollar, every word my mother had ever said to justify why my money was, in some way I still couldn't fully name, hers. I had no idea, sitting there in the dark with a cup of cold coffee I hadn't touched, that within 6 weeks I'd be sitting across from a detective, a forensic accountant, and a family law attorney, laying out a paper trail that would end with my parents facing actual criminal charges, and that the money would turn out to be the smallest part of what they were willing to take. I'd been saving for 4 months, dimes from my work apron at the diner where I picked up double shifts most weekends, pennies scraped from under the couch cushions. Every spare dollar went into an old cookie tin I kept behind the rice in the cabinet, because if it stayed in my wallet, it disappeared into gas money or a school supply list, or one of the 100 small emergencies that eat a single mother's budget alive. Willow never asked for anything. That's the part people don't believe when I tell this story. She wasn't a kid who whined in the toy aisle or threw herself on the floor over a candy bar at the checkout. She'd stood at the window of the little shop 2 blocks from our apartment for weeks, just stood there, hands pressed to the glass, looking at a doll in a blue dress that wasn't even the most expensive one in the display. She never once asked me to buy it. She just looked at it like it was something from another world, and then she'd take my hand and we'd keep walking. So when I finally counted out enough coins on my kitchen table, stacking dimes into towers of 10, rolling pennies into paper sleeves I'd gotten from the bank, I felt like I'd won something bigger than a $14 toy. I felt like I'd given my daughter proof that somebody noticed what she wanted, even when she never said it out loud. We ran into my family by the registers on the way out. Bad timing, or maybe it was never going to be good timing with them, ever. My mother was there with my sister Janice, who had a designer bag hanging from her shoulder that cost more than my last 3 paychecks combined, nails freshly done, looking at me and Willow the way you'd look at something you found on the bottom of your shoe. My father trailed a few steps behind them, checking his phone, the way he did when he wanted to seem uninvolved right up until the moment he wasn't. My mother's hand moved before I even understood what was happening. She snatched the box straight out of Willow's grip in the checkout line, plastic crinkling, and held it up like she'd caught us shoplifting. "If you can barely afford to eat, why are you buying expensive dreams for a girl who shouldn't even be here?" she said, loud enough that the cashier stopped scanning, loud enough that a stranger 3 feet away turned to look. Then, before I could even respond, she was already waving my niece over. "Piper, sweetheart, come here. Your cousin will make much better use of this." Piper ran up and wrapped both arms around the box like it was Christmas morning, and it might as well have been, because my mother beamed at her the way she never once beamed at Willow. "How beautiful! Thank you, Grandma," Piper squealed, and Janice smiled like she'd been waiting all day for exactly this moment to land. Willow didn't cry. She didn't scream or grab for it. She just stood there, small and silent, her empty hand still curled in the shape of holding something that wasn't there anymore. I reached for the doll. My father stepped directly into my path, close enough that I could smell the coffee on his breath. "Do not disrespect your mother," he said, low and even, like he was correcting a mildly embarrassing mistake at a dinner party. "It's her birthday present," I said. My voice came out shaking, which I hated because I wanted to sound strong, and instead I sounded exactly as small as they'd always made me feel. "I paid for it, with my own money." He leaned in. "You've already embarrassed this family enough with your life," he said. And then he said it, flat, bored, like he was reading off a grocery list. "Your daughter is a mistake we all have to carry." Willow heard every word. I watched it land on her face. Not confusion, not even hurt exactly, just a kind of quiet stillness, like she was filing the sentence away somewhere she'd carry it for a long time. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I took her hand and walked out of that store with a receipt in my pocket for a doll I no longer had, and a version of my father's voice that I knew, even then, I would hear again at 3 in the morning for years. That night, after her bath, after I'd read the same 2 chapters chapters of the same well-worn book we always read. After I'd tucked her in with the one-eyed teddy bear she refused to sleep without, she looked up at me in the dark. "Mommy, am I really just a mistake?" I told her no. I told her, with everything I had, that she was the best thing that had ever happened to me. The only thing I'd ever done right. Some days the only reason I got out of bed at all. I kissed her forehead. I turned off the light. I stood in her doorway for a long minute after, listening to her breathing even out, before I went to sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I never drank. That's when my phone buzzed with the bank alert that would end up changing everything. I told myself it had to be a mistake. A processing error, a duplicate charge, something a phone call could untangle in 5 minutes flat. I opened the app 3 times, like the 4th time might show something different. It didn't. A transfer made that afternoon, while Willow and I were standing in a checkout line getting torn apart by our own family for $2,130. My mother's name attached to the authorization. 5 years ago, right after Willow was born, when I was exhausted and broke and grateful that someone in my family was pretending to care, my mother had asked to be added to my account. "In case you ever need help," she'd said. And I'd said yes, because saying no to my mother had never once in my life gone well for me. I never thought about that access again. Not once in 5 years. Not until that number sat in front of me at midnight, refusing to change no matter how many times I refreshed the screen. I called the number on the back of my card. A recorded voice told me hold times were longer than usual. I sat with the phone against my ear for 40 minutes, staring at the wobbly leg on my kitchen table that I kept meaning to fix, listening to hold music that looped every 90 seconds. When a person finally picked up, she was kind and useless, in the specific way call center employees are useless when the fix is above their pay grade. She confirmed the transfer had gone through. She confirmed my mother's name was still an authorized user. She told me I'd need to visit a branch in person to dispute an authorized user transaction because technically, and I could hear her wince through the phone as she said it, my mother hadn't done anything the account's terms didn't allow her to do. I hung up and sat in the dark a long time. I told myself it was still probably a misunderstanding. Maybe she meant to move money into her own account and fat-fingered mine by mistake. Maybe there was an explanation that didn't require me to accept what every part of my body already knew. That rationalization lasted exactly as long as it took me to remember the sound of her voice at the checkout counter. A girl who shouldn't even be here. She hadn't taken that money because she needed it. She had a walk-in closet of designer bags and a husband who golfed twice a week. She'd taken it because she could. Because as far as she was concerned, I still belonged to her. And so did every dollar in my account. And so, apparently, did the right to decide what my daughter deserved. I didn't sleep. I sat at that table until the sun came up, writing down every date I could remember of every gift and loan that had somehow always come with strings. Every time she'd reminded me she could see my balance. Every small cruelty dressed up as concern. By 8 a.m., I'd dropped Willow at my neighbor Denise's apartment. Denise, who'd raised 3 kids alone and never once made me feel small for doing the same. And I walked into my bank branch still wearing yesterday's clothes. The branch manager's name was Carl Ibarra. He'd been with the bank almost 11 years, according to the plaque on his desk, and he had the unhurried patience of someone who'd seen every version of a bad morning walk through his door. I laid it all out, the joint access from 5 years ago, the unauthorized transfer, the pattern of control I was only now putting into words for the first time in my adult life. He typed for a while, pulled up the transaction, and went quiet for a second too long. Then he looked up at me and asked the question I'd apparently been waiting my whole life for someone to finally ask. "Do you want to file this as fraud?" I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence. Carl walked me through it. Because my mother was a legally authorized user on the account, even if that authorization had been secured under circumstances that felt, to me, like something closer to manipulation than consent, the bank's internal fraud team would need to review whether the transfer constituted a misuse of authorized access rather than a straightforward unauthorized transaction. It wasn't as simple as reversing a stolen card charge. It was going to require documentation, a formal dispute, and likely outside legal counsel if I wanted the authorization revoked and the funds recovered. He gave me a case number. He gave me the name of the bank's fraud investigations line, a woman named Priya Chandrasekaran, who'd call me within 2 business days. And he did one more thing I hadn't asked for. He removed my mother as an authorized user on the spot, effective immediately, pending the fraud review. "She won't be able to touch this account again," he said. "Whatever else happens, that part's done today." I cried in the bank parking lot, not from sadness. Relief has its own particular kind of tears, and I hadn't felt them in longer than I could remember. I told myself that was the hard part over. I told myself my mother, faced with a closed door, would back off the way bullies sometimes do when the free access disappears. I was wrong. That rationalization lasted exactly 4 hours, until my phone rang with her name on the screen for the 9th time that day. I didn't answer. I let it go to voicemail because I already knew, in the pit of my stomach, that answering live would mean absorbing whatever she said without a record of it. The voicemail ran 2 minutes and 40 seconds. I've listened to it more times than I can count since, and I know it by heart. She started calm, that practiced honeyed calm she used right up until she didn't get her way. "I don't know what's gotten into you, closing me out like some kind of criminal. That money was for your own good. You clearly can't manage it yourself." Then the calm cracked, the way it always eventually did. "You want to make this a whole legal thing? Fine. I'll tell everyone exactly what kind of mother lets her child parade around with some doll instead of paying her bills. I'll tell them what I actually think happened with that baby's father, and how convenient it is that you're suddenly the victim in every story. My hands were shaking again by the time it ended, not because of what she'd threatened to say. None of it was true, and I could prove exactly whose name was on Willow's birth certificate, exactly who'd walked away, and exactly who hadn't, but because of how easily she reached for Willow as a weapon. Not me, Willow. My 5-year-old, who'd done nothing except stand quietly at a store window for weeks, hoping. I played it a second time, sitting on the edge of my bed with the phone pressed so hard against my ear it left a mark. Somewhere in the middle of the second listen, I noticed something I'd missed the first time. A small pause right before she mentioned Willow's father, like she was deciding in real time exactly how far she was willing to go. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a slip born of anger. It was a choice, made deliberately. And something about hearing that pause a second time made it worse than the words themselves. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself it was just an angry, empty threat from a woman who'd never once followed through on anything that cost her comfort. She'd made bigger threats before, over holidays skipped, over birthdays where I hadn't shown up with the right amount of gratitude, and none of them had ever gone anywhere beyond the phone. I was wrong about that too, though it would take another 11 days to find out exactly how wrong. That night, I texted my sister Janice on the small, foolish hope that maybe she'd talk sense into our mother, the way she sometimes had when we were kids and I was the one always catching the blame. Can you tell her to stop calling? She left a message about Willow's dad. It's not okay. Janice's reply came almost an hour later. Maybe if you weren't so dramatic about everything, none of this would be happening. Mom's just worried about you. I read that twice, then put the phone face down on the nightstand because I understood, finally and completely, that there was no ally left in that family. Just a mother willing to threaten a 5-year-old to get her way, a father who called that same child a mistake without blinking, and a sister who'd rather call me dramatic than admit any of it was real. I saved the voicemail in 3 places: my phone, a cloud backup, and an email I sent to myself with a timestamp. Because some instinct in me, some part that had apparently been taking notes my whole life without my permission, understood that documentation was going to matter more than my own memory of events. I saved Janice's text too, though I didn't yet know how directly it would matter. Denise, my neighbor, was the one who gave me the name. Her daughter had gone through a custody dispute 2 years earlier and had nothing but relief in her voice when she talked about the woman who'd represented her. Attorney Renata Okafor had been practicing family and financial law for 16 years, the last 9 of them running her own small practice out of a strip mall office that smelled like fresh coffee and printer toner. She listened to the whole story without interrupting once, which I hadn't experienced from an adult in my family in longer than I could remember. 2 separate issues here, she said, tapping a pen against a legal pad covered in her own shorthand. The financial exploitation is one track. That's a police report, a bank fraud claim, and potentially criminal charges depending on what the investigation turns up. The threats regarding your daughter are a second track, and I want you taking that seriously in its own right, separate from the money. She asked for everything: the voicemail, screenshots of the transaction, a timeline of every instance I could remember of my mother using account access or financial leverage to control decisions in my life. She had me write out the checkout store scene word for word, and she underlined the mistake line twice on her legal pad without saying anything about it, which somehow felt more validating than if she had. This kind of pattern rarely starts with money, she said, tapping her pen against the pad. The money's just the part that shows up on a bank statement. Everything before it, the comments about your daughter, the way access was granted under emotional pressure right after she was born, that's the actual foundation. Courts understand that better than people expect. She also asked me something nobody had asked in years. Has anyone besides your parents and your sister ever had unsupervised access to Willow? Anyone at all, even briefly? I told her no, and I meant it, and I had no idea yet how important that answer was going to become. She wrote it down, circled it, and moved on without explaining why. In the specific, unhurried way I was starting to recognize meant she already suspected something I hadn't considered. Renata filed a formal letter that afternoon demanding my mother's cease all contact regarding financial matters and any implied threats concerning my daughter, and she flagged, gently but seriously, that if the threats escalated, we'd be looking at a protective order. She sent it by certified mail and email both, time-stamped, with a copy retained in her own files. Belt and suspenders, she called it, the first time I heard her use the phrase she'd repeat throughout the entire case. I drove home telling myself the letter would be the thing that finally made them stop. People don't usually double down once an attorney's letterhead is involved, right? I was wrong about that most of all. It happened on a Wednesday, 3 days after Renata's letter went out. I was on my lunch break at the diner, phone buzzing in my apron pocket, and I almost didn't check it, the same way I'd almost ignored the bank alert 11 days earlier. It was Willow's Daycare, Ms. Adesi Nwosu, the center director, her voice tight in a way I'd never heard from her in the 8 months Willow had been enrolled there. I need you to come in right away, she said. Someone came to pick up Willow. She wasn't on the authorized list, and our front desk almost let her through before I caught it. My stomach dropped so fast I actually had to grab the counter. Who? I said, though some cold, certain part of me already knew. A woman who identified herself as Willow's grandmother. She had photo ID, said there'd been a family emergency and she needed to take Willow home. Our policy requires anyone not on the pickup list to be verified by a phone call to the parent first. That's the only reason this didn't go further. I called you 3 times before I called the daycare's main line to log it. I was in my car within 90 seconds, apron still on, driving faster than I should have. By the time I got there, my mother was gone. She'd left before Ms. Nwosu could finish the verification call. The moment she realized the front desk wasn't simply going to hand my daughter over on her say-so. Willow was fine, completely unaware, sitting at a little table doing a puzzle. No idea how close she'd come to being taken by a woman who, less than 2 weeks earlier, had threatened to weaponize her existence in a voicemail I still had saved in 3 places. Ms. Nwosu had done everything right. She'd logged the incident time-stamped in the daycare's official records, kept the sign-in sheet showing my mother's name and the ID she'd presented, and she handed me a printed copy of the incident report before I left the building. I sat in my car in the daycare parking lot and shook so hard I had to wait almost 20 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. That night, once Willow was asleep, I called Renata. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished explaining, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost its careful, measured calm. "This changes everything," she said. "This isn't just a financial dispute anymore. This is an attempted unauthorized removal of a minor on the heels of a documented threat. We're filing for an emergency protective order tomorrow morning, and I want you filing a police report tonight." I filed the police report that same night. The responding officer connected me the next morning with Detective Marcus Whitfield, 17 years on the force, the last 9 in the family crimes unit. He had the kind of unhurried, careful attention that made me feel, for the first time in this whole ordeal, like someone with real authority was actually on my side. "Walk me through everything," he said, "from the beginning. Don't skip anything because it seems small." I told him about the doll, about the checkout line, about the mistake line, said flat and bored, right in front of a 5-year-old. He wrote it all down without a flicker of judgment on his face, and when I got to the bank transfer, he stopped me. "You still have that voicemail?" I played it for him right there. He listened to the whole 2 minutes and 40 seconds twice, jaw tightening slightly the second time through, and made a note that I'd later learn got flagged in the case file as a documented verbal threat tied directly to the subsequent daycare incident, a detail Renata told me mattered enormously for establishing intent, not just opportunity. "The daycare piece is what elevates this," Detective Whitfield said. "Attempted removal, following a threat, following a financial exploitation claim already under bank review. That's a pattern, and patterns are what juries and judges pay attention to." 2 days later, I sat across from Priya Chandrasekaran, the bank's fraud investigator, in a small conference room that smelled faintly of hand sanitizer. She'd pulled 5 years of account history and laid it across the table in neat tabbed printouts, every instance of my mother accessing the account, cross-referenced against dates. "There's a pattern here beyond the transfer you flagged," Priya said, sliding a highlighted page toward me. "Smaller withdrawals going back nearly 3 years. 20 here, 40 there. Amounts small enough you might not have noticed or might have assumed were bank fees. Combined, it's closer to $6,100 over the full period, not counting the transfer that triggered your original complaint." I felt sick reading it. Not because the number was catastrophic, though it was more than I had ever imagined, but because of how long it had been happening without me noticing. How long she'd been quietly draining a struggling single mother's account in amounts calculated to stay beneath suspicion. Priya's official report, filed with the bank's internal fraud unit, concluded there was sufficient evidence of unauthorized in-substance transactions to support both a civil recovery claim and a referral to local law enforcement for potential financial exploitation charges. A designation, she explained, that in our state applied specifically because of my mother's position of trust and my documented financial vulnerability as a single parent. Renata added Priya's findings to the growing case file alongside the daycare incident report and Detective Whitfield's notes. 3 professionals, 3 separate systems, all of it converging on the same conclusion I'd been too afraid to say out loud for 5 years. This had never been an accident, and it had never been about love. The emergency protective order hearing was scheduled fast, 48 hours out, because the daycare incident qualified as exigent given the pattern of threats. Renata warned me the timeline would feel impossible. She was right. I had 48 hours to gather every piece of documentation, to arrange childcare for the hearing itself, to keep working my shifts because rent didn't pause for any of this, and to somehow hold myself together enough to sit across a courtroom from my own parents and describe, out loud, in detail, exactly what they'd done to my daughter and to me. I barely slept those 2 nights. I kept running through what would happen if the judge didn't grant the order. What would happen if my mother tried the daycare again, somewhere Ms. Nwosu's careful policy wasn't in place to stop her? What would happen if my father's flat, bored voice found its way to Willow again, and this time I wasn't standing close enough to walk her out the door? The morning of the hearing, my hands wouldn't stop shaking as I buttoned Willow into her coat at Denise's door. She looked up at me with that same steady, searching expression she'd had the night she asked if she was a mistake. "Are you going somewhere scary, Mommy?" "I'm going somewhere important," I told her, which felt truer than anything I could have said. In the courtroom, Renata laid out the case in the same calm, methodical way she'd laid out every step of this since Denise first gave me her number. The voicemail played over the courtroom speakers, my mother's honeyed threat about Willow's father filling a room full of strangers who had no context for how ordinary that particular cruelty was for her. The daycare incident report went into evidence as Exhibit C. Priya's fraud findings went in as Exhibit D. Detective Whitfield's case case notes, establishing the pattern across all three, went in as Exhibit E. My mother sat across the room in a blazer I recognized, her face doing the thing it always did in front of people whose opinions she cared about. Soft, wounded, misunderstood. My father sat beside her, arms crossed, checking his watch twice like he had somewhere better to be. The judge granted the emergency protective order. No contact, direct or indirect, with Willow. No contact regarding financial matters with me. A formal hearing date set 30 days out for a permanent order, alongside a referral noted in the file for the pending financial exploitation charges Detective Whitfield's unit was already building. I didn't feel triumphant walking out of that courthouse. I felt something quieter and heavier. The particular exhaustion of a fight that isn't over yet, but that you're no longer fighting entirely alone. The permanent order hearing, 30 days later, didn't take long. The pattern Detective Whitfield had built. The checkout store cruelty as documented context. The systematic small withdrawals Priya had traced back 3 years. The recorded threat, the attempted daycare removal, left very little room for my parents' attorney to argue anything except damage control. The judge granted the permanent protective order. Full no contact, financial and personal, with an explicit provision naming the daycare and school as protected locations requiring immediate police notification for any attempted contact. 2 weeks after that, the district attorney's office formally filed financial exploitation charges against my mother, citing the pattern Priya's investigation had documented. The systematic withdrawals over 3 years, culminating in the $2,830 transfer, all while occupying a legally recognized position of trust with respect to a documented vulnerable adult household. My father was named as a secondary party for his role in pressuring me, on record via a separate witness statement from the cashier who'd been present at the store, not to report the initial theft. Janice's involvement in the daycare incident. She'd driven my mother there and waited in the car, according to the parking lot security footage Detective Whitfield subpoenaed, earned her a formal police interview and a warning that any further involvement in violating the protective order would result in her own charges. Her designer bag composure cracked considerably once she was the one being asked the questions. The fallout rippled outward in ways I hadn't expected. My mother's part-time position volunteering at Piper's school, a position built almost entirely on the same charming, generous public persona she'd always performed, quietly evaporated once the charges became a matter of public court record. My father's golf league, small-town gossip being what it is, apparently found out too, and I heard secondhand that his tea times got noticeably lonelier. None of it felt like the cartoonish downfall you'd want in a movie. It felt like consequences. Ordinary, procedural, paper trail consequences. The kind that don't come with a dramatic gavel bang, just a slow tightening of a life that had spent decades assuming it would never have to answer for anything. Willow is 6 now. She still has the one-eyed teddy bear, though he's been joined by a small collection of stuffed animals she's named after every professional who was kind to us during that year. There's a bear named Renata, a slightly worn rabbit named Priya, and a stuffed dog, inexplicably named Detective. The financial exploitation case against my mother resolved in a plea agreement. Restitution of the full amount Priya's investigation traced, plus a suspended sentence contingent on compliance with the protective order's terms. My father accepted a lesser charge tied to witness intimidation regarding the store incident. Neither of them has attempted contact since, protective order or not. I think, in the end, the exposure did more to stop them than any single legal consequence could have. People who build their whole identity on being unquestionable don't do well once they've been questioned in open court. I still work at the diner, though I picked up fewer double shifts once the restitution came through and gave us some breathing room for the first time in years. I bought Willow a new doll for her 6th birthday, not to replace the first one, which still sits oddly in an evidence log somewhere, tagged and photographed as Exhibit A. I bought her a different one, yellow dress this time. She named it Coin, after the cookie tin, which is either the most on-the-nose thing a 5-year-old has ever done or the smartest, and honestly, I'm not sure there's a difference. She hasn't asked if she's a mistake again, not once, in a full year. But a few months ago, out of nowhere, while we were doing dishes together, she looked up and asked me something else instead. Mommy, why did Grandma not like me? I told her the truth, in words a 6-year-old could hold on to. That some people are so used to being in charge of everyone else's life that they can't stand it when someone smaller than them has something good. That it was never, not for one single second, about anything she'd done. She thought about that for a while, drying a plate with more concentration than the task really required. That's a them problem, she finally said, in the exact flat, matter-of-fact tone my father once used to call her a mistake. I laughed so hard I had to put the dish down. It was, without question, the best legal argument anyone involved in this entire case ever made. If you made it this far, she's safe, she's loved, and she knows exactly whose problem it was all along.